Hello, welcome back to Wednesday Word. Thank you so much for joining me this evening as we continue our study of the writings of the minor prophet Micah. Last time we looked at some introductory material, started talking about the first chapter, and we're basically just barely into the second half of the first chapter when we ran out of time or when I felt it wasn't wise for us to continue. I think it would be good if we went back there and basically reread that section of scripture and regrouped, and hopefully we'll do a better job of time management. And if I'm really blessed, Siri won't try to help me this time and we might progress and do better. In any case, you remember that Micah is not only dealing with the evil that he sees, but this little short prophetic book has some scripture about Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Conqueror, the Good Shepherd, that is going to totally be encouraging as well. So if you missed the first session, I encourage you to go back. But even if you don't do that, if you're just now joining me in this study of this short book, I really believe, even though there is the appropriate amount of doom and prophetic judgment coming, there is still so much to be seen in this book that is not only encouraging, but so incredibly relevant for where we are today. So to make good use of our time, let me go back, and I actually want to reread Micah chapter 1, verses 8 through 16. And I did read it, but I really only got to make comments like on the first couple of verses, like verses 8 and 9. We really just were not very far into that, so I think that would be worth our time. Again, Micah chapter 1, beginning our reading at verse 8. Therefore, I will wail and howl. I will go stripped and naked. I will make a wailing like the jackals and a mourning like the ostriches. For her wounds are incurable. Hold on to that thought. For it has come to Judah. It has come to the gate of my people, to Jerusalem. Tell it not in Gath. Weep not at all. In Beth Aphrah, roll yourself in the dust. Pass by in naked shame, you inhabitants of Shaphir. The inhabitant of Zaanan does not go out. Beth Ezel mourns. Its place to stand is taken away from you. For the inhabitant of Maroth pined for good, but disaster came down from the Lord to the gate of Jerusalem. O inhabitant of Lachish, harness the chariot to the swift steeds. She was the beginning of sin to the daughter of Zion. For the transgressions of Israel were found in you. Lord, may it never be said that the transgressions of our world are found in His church. Therefore, verse 14, you shall give presents to Moresheth Gath. The house of Akzib shall be a lie to the kings of Israel. I will yet bring an heir to you, O inhabitant of Mareshah. The glory of Israel shall come to Adullam. Make yourself bald and cut off your hair because of your precious children. Enlarge your baldness like an eagle, for they shall go from you into captivity. Now, we hear the grief and the pathos in these words, even if some of the references are a little bit foreign to us. It's understandable that Micah is sad and he's mourning. He feels this deep-seated grief because Samaria is going to fall. God has said, Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom generally is going to fall. The Assyrians are going to raid them, destroy them, haul them off into slavery and exile. So for this prophet who lives in the countryside of the southern kingdom, as we discussed last time, he feels sadness because Judah, the southern kingdom, is sister kingdom to the northern kingdom, and that's like saying my cousins are going to get hauled off into captivity. So he feels this sadness because of the connection, the kinship, the sisterhood of those two kingdoms. He knows fully that rejection of God, rejection of what's right, rejection of God's principles, that's exactly what has led the northern kingdom to where they are obviously headed at warp drive. But he is sad even though he knows they are going to reap what they've sown. Now, to make sure that his message is clear and hard to ignore, and that it will be so memorable that it's likely that people will pass on what he said to others, he got a little bit radical. I said last time he used shock value, and I think that's true. Most Bible scholars believe that Micah is mimicking what it would be like and what would happen to captives who were being led off into exile, led off into slavery. They would be stripped, they would be humiliated, they would be mistreated. And so he's weeping and wailing as he goes through the streets. If we take it literal at face value, he's doing it stripped and naked. Now, there are some Bible scholars and teachers who believe that that's not quite right. They think it means barefoot and no outer garment. I'm really not going to debate that issue. I think it's a matter of interpretation and what extreme you take those words to. But here's what I do know. He is mourning and wailing as if he's wailing for the dead because he's wailing for the spiritually dead. God, help us to see the importance of viewing people in the light of two deaths, the death of this body and the death that represents separation from God. Now, we know what the Word says, that we're not to fear the one that can kill this body, but the idea of being separated from God for eternity is a totally different concept. So he's weeping and wailing and crying out in a loud and very intense voice. In fact, remember, he uses lots of poetic devices, lots of plays on words. I talked about that last time as well. And so here he's wailing and howling like jackals. His voice is so stressed and so used up after he's done this for a while that he basically sounds like a little baby ostrich that can't make very much noise. So the idea is that he will lament and he will cry out with this message of impending doom until he's so exhausted and until his voice is so stressed that he has nothing left to give. Now, part of verse 8 has a little bit of let's say differentiation in the various interpretations of it. So we'll just leave it at that and not debate so much whether he was totally naked or he just had on that undergarment that he would have worn, that tunic that would have gone underneath the outer robe. Now, when Micah says that the wounds of Samaria are incurable, if you listen to me as I read that, then you heard me say, pay attention to that, because here's what had happened. Samaria, or the northern kingdom, was not only wicked, seeped in idolatry, and so walking apart from and in defiance of the laws of God that there's no other way to describe it. But now those false teachings, those false practices, those ungodly practices are being exported to the southern kingdom, and they're now in Judah, literally in Jerusalem. And so here's the message that we pick up on. Our wickedness, we will pay. But when you begin to influence others to follow in your wickedness, there is a new level of condemnation from God. I think that lines up with the rest of Scripture. We know that James makes it clear in James chapter 3 and verse 1 that someone who teaches another is held to a higher level of accountability. So when the northern kingdom becomes the source of infiltrating idolatry and wickedness into the southern kingdom, then God is like, you crossed a line a long time ago. Now, that does not mean that Judah is not responsible for its own choices, as we all are. So it's not like Micah is letting Judah off the hook, so to speak, because they're breaking God's laws, and we know the reckoning day was coming for Judah as well, not necessarily in the same way and in the same time frame as the northern kingdom, but certainly it was coming. We know that Sennacherib, the Assyrian, conquered numerous cities in Judah. We know that Hezekiah ended up paying tribute, but the southern kingdom was not totally conquered, totally decimated, hauled into exile by Assyria like the northern kingdom was. That did not come until Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon came on the scene quite a bit of time later. Now, we know, here you have it. Micah says, look, it's coming. And the northern kingdom is going to pay, but Judah is going to begin to pay too, because it is responsible for its own choices. And so he begins to call out these towns that I read in your hearing as we looked in the text, as if he's calling out to them to mourn in advance for what is coming against them. He actually mentions 10 cities in all. 5 of them are north of Jerusalem, and 5 of them are south, or more accurately, southwest of Jerusalem. And it's like he is delineating this corridor through which the Assyrian enemy would come, and the towns that would be most definitely and most drastically impacted by the presence of that enemy force on their land and in their presence. So he is using here a very sophisticated and very clever poetic device. He uses play on words. He takes the names of these towns, the meanings of these towns, and he associates them with things that are related to what's about to happen to Judah. And as I said last time, unfortunately, we lose a little bit of the impact of his use of language here, and it is quite sophisticated. But when you translate from one language to another, certain things about poetry are lost because words aren't equal, syllables aren't equal, sounds aren't equal. So what I'm going to do is take these towns, and the best we can, we're going to talk about what the names mean in English, and then I will come back and expand that just a bit to see how it fit into what Micah was saying prophetically. Okay, 10 towns, 5 north of Jerusalem, 5 southwest of Jerusalem, and the first one was Beth Aphra, and it means house of dust. Well, rolling in the dust. Okay. The next one was Shaphir, town of beauty. Zayanin is town of going out or outlet. Beth Ezel is retreat house or house of separation. Maroth is bitter places. Lachish is town of horses or impregnable hill. Moresheth Gath, possession of Gath, Akzib, town of a lie or place of deceit, Mareshah, town of inheritance or hereditary city implying of Judah, and Adullam, town of refuge. Now, what's he trying to say with these towns, the progression as you would move south, and the suggestion by the meaning of the names of these towns? Now, the first thing we need to know is out of those 10 cities, 8 of them were what we'll call Jewish, and 2 of them were what we'll call heathen or pagan cities. Did you notice that Micah said, don't announce this prophecy in Gath? Now, that's probably familiar language because David basically lamented, don't spread this news when Saul and his son Jonathan were slain, and he was so sad and in such deep mourning. But Gath was one of the 5 principal Philistine cities. Do you remember that? Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Ekron, and Gath. Go back to the stories of Goliath and the stories of the Philistines, and you will see that there were those 5 principal cities. They all had a head or a king. And so you're talking about cities that used to be under Philistine control and are now basically kind of mixed in under Jewish control, but certainly nobody in pagan cities nobody there would celebrate when things went well for the Jews. In fact, they would celebrate when things did not go well for the Jews. So this idea that there would be an invasion or that there would be retribution from God on the people that Jehovah actually called his own would be the source of laughter and celebration for these pagan communities. So Micah dreads the scorn that these people in these basically Philistine and pagan communities will feel when they learn that God's people have sinned to the point that God is going to let punishment come their way. Now, according to some scholars of the Hebrew language, this entire passage and all of this information about these cities, when it refers to the dwellers or the inhabitants of those cities, it's in feminine form. Now, that's an alien concept to those of us who have English as our primary language. But in many other languages, nouns, not just the ones that refer to people, but nouns in general have gender. For example, in French, table is feminine, and so is door. So it's just a difference in language, and it has to do with what kind of articles and what kind of adjectives you use to describe those things. So he's saying here, or at least some scholars are, that Micah uses feminine form here. And if that is accurate, then the idea is going to be that terrible things are going to happen to the women, and because the men are helpless because of the strength and the power of the invaders, they're going to be helpless. Hands are going to be tied to do anything to prevent these terrible things that are going to happen. Okay, so what do we see here? In Beth Aphrah, roll yourself in dust. Do you remember his saying that? Rolling yourself in dust would be like sackcloth and ashes. It would be an outward sign of mourning. In the Middle East, grabbing dust and throwing it up so that it covered you when it came down would be a sign of abject sadness and deep mourning. So he says, okay, when we start this trek down through these towns, mourn, because what's about to happen is a bad thing. Okay, so here we see that he's previously in verse 6 introduced the prophecy against Samaria and the northern kingdom by saying, look, this is what's coming. But here in this section, he just jumps in to what's going to happen to the southern kingdom without any prefacing comments. So that's what we're seeing. What about Zaanann? These residents are not even going to leave their houses because of the abject terror that will fall on them because of the coming invaders. Beth Ezel, it was a fortified city. Under normal circumstances, you would have expected those people to be a force in assisting in resisting an invasion. But the suggestion from Micah here is that the people are going to mourn because of the suffering around them, and they're basically going to have no strength to fight or to resist. What about Maroth? According to Micah, they will painfully wait for good to come to them, only no good is coming, because Jehovah is going to allow the evil to walk right up to the gate of Jerusalem. The invasion of Syria is going to bring violence and destruction put in place by Jehovah for judgment. Now, I'll remind you again, Assyria is going to wipe out the northern kingdom, haul them off into exile. But it's also going to encroach on the southern kingdom and take certain cities. And I think I said something last time about it probably was an exaggeration to say all the cities, but it took principal cities that would have led to the use of that concept. So here, Micah wants them to understand the northern kingdom's going to be annihilated, but the southern kingdom is about to be drastically impacted. And violence and destruction and paying tribute are going to be the result, though the total destruction of Jerusalem, we know when that came. Isaiah, again, remember there's some similarity in some of the writing with Micah. Isaiah says in chapter 10, verse 5, "Woe to Assyria, the rod of my anger, and the staff in whose hand is my indignation." So what about Lachish? Well, the idea here is, according to Micah, they might have a chance to escape, except that place is also going to be judged because it was beginning to indulge in the same sin, this idea of missing the mark, of not hitting God's target. In other words, just like the people in Jerusalem and the other cities that Micah lists here, this town was beginning to sin, though maybe not as deeply into it as some of the others, so things are not going to go well for them either. So the fact that the worship of Baal and all of the horrific abominations that went with that have come to Zion, to Jerusalem, to the city where God put his name, then that result is going to bring the difficulty that was in the near future and the horrible difficulty that was slightly more distant down the road. Now, the use of Lachish and the word Rakesh, which means swift steed. In the original Hebrew, Micah uses them very close together. And it was a classic Hebrew play on words, and he was trying to send that idea of you might be able to escape, you might be able to get away with things, but what you've done is going to catch up to you. Now, the daughter of Zion and Moresheth Gath, by the way, that's Micah's hometown. Those two places have been joined together in sin, but are now going to be separated in judgment. The idea here is the same idea that would be conveyed if a bride price or marriage portion of the present for the bride was returned, and it basically would be saying there's going to be a divorce. I'm giving her back. So here, sin has set up what sin always do, and that is ultimate separation. What a horrible thing when one day there will be no more chances, and the sin for which people never repented will bring ultimate and total and complete separation from God. Achzib would be deceitful to the kings of Israel. This town is about 8 miles north of Jerusalem, and it would be helpless and would even turn traitor. Instead of fighting the invaders, they would be traitors and not good partners in any efforts to stay the influx of these Assyrian invaders. So Jehovah was going to let the Assyrians raid, overrun, take the northern kingdom captive. The southern kingdom was also going to pay a price. Mareshah, the hereditary city, with the assumption that we understand that means of Judah, was now going to be in the possession of the Assyrians. They were going to come and take these people captive. And the suggestion with that city is that the nobility, the people who should be the first to participate in battle and stand in battle, would literally flee to Adullam, the next city farther down south. And that city should ring a bell with us. The idea of the caves of Adullam, and we should associate those with a man named David, and a period of time spent in those caves, a time that was not an emotionally good time for him and for those men who were with him. Did you notice the reference to cutting off hair? Now, cutting off hair is a sign of sorrow and grief, and in some cases, humiliation. So Micah is warning these people that they're headed into a period of humiliation, a period of mourning, a period of difficulty. And so the idea that there would be baldness like an eagle, I'll get the right word out. Baldness like an eagle leaves us a little confused. You remember I've talked to you several times as we've studied some of these minor prophets that probably eagle is not a good translation there. In all likelihood, these references in these prophetic writings, those are vultures. Eagles are not scavenger birds. Some of the things that are described do not fit eagles at all, and it's just a translation issue. Now, okay, so a vulture would have a bare head and a bare neck. That makes perfect sense. The warnings are really clear. Again, we lose a lot in translation here. But Micah wants these people, every time they hear the name of their city, he wants an immediate association with what he has shared with them prophetically. And he does it in such a clever way that the very words themselves will be suggestive. Again, we lose part of that, but we understand it's a translation issue. Okay, we know that Assyria plagued Judah. We know that Babylon ultimately finished off what Assyria only partially did. We know that most people were carried off to Babylon in the second and third raids in 597 and 586 BC, but we know the initial raids were in about 605 BC. And so Micah's warning, look, there's a level of grief that's coming immediately, and there is a devastating level above and beyond that if there is not a change. Here's the truth. You cannot reject God over and over. Ignore the prophets. Ignore the teaching of the word. Ignore those who actually practice and preach the real truth indefinitely, because eventually, defying God, breaking his laws, rejecting his son, those things are going to have consequences. I know the people in Micah's day did not have Jesus and a relationship with him like is available to us, but there is always going to be a sundown on defiance against God. Okay, let's go now quickly back to Micah chapter 2, and let's look at the content of this chapter. And yes, it's a woe chapter, but Micah has some relevant things to say to us here. Micah chapter 2, verse 1. Woe to those who devise iniquity and work out evil on their beds. At morning light they practice it, because it is in the power of their hand. They covet fields and take them by violence, also houses, and seize them. So they oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Therefore, thus says the Lord. Okay, because of what they do, described in the first 2 verses, here's what God says. Behold, against this family I am devising disaster, from which you cannot remove your necks, nor shall you walk haughtily, for this is an evil time. In that day one shall take up a proverb against you and lament with bitter lamentations, saying, we are utterly destroyed. He has changed the heritage of my people. How he has removed it from me. To a turncoat he has divided our fields. Therefore, you will have no one to determine the boundaries by lot in the assembly of the Lord. Do not prattle, you say, to those who prophesy. So they shall not prophesy to you. They shall not return insult for insult. You who are named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord restricted? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him who walks uprightly? Lately, my people have risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from those who trust you as they pass by, like men returned from war. The women of my people you cast out from their pleasant houses. From their children you have taken away my glory forever. Arise and depart, for this is not your rest. Because it is defiled, it shall destroy, yes, with utter destruction. If a man should walk in a false spirit and speak a lie, saying, I will prophesy to you of wine and drink, even he would be the prattler of this people. I will surely assemble all of you, O Jacob. I will surely gather the remnant of Israel. I will put them together like sheep of the fold, like a flock in the midst of their pasture. They shall make a loud noise because of so many people. The one who breaks open will come up before them. They will break out, pass through the gate, and go out by it. Their king will pass before them with the Lord at their head. Now, here in chapter 2 and also in chapter 3, we're going to see Micah prophesy doom for the corrupt, greedy oppressors of God's people and for false prophets and religious leaders who are out for what they can get. Now, he's specifically calling out those who have power, who have position, who have influence, and use it to take advantage of people so that they can accomplish their own selfish goals. Now, clearly, Micah wants it to be understood that idolatry is not the only problem with God's people. The injustice of abusing and misusing and literally stealing from other people is also definitive proof of sin. I don't think I have to remind you of anything other than the 2 great commandments. We love God, and because we love him, we obey him. But the word also says that I'm to love my neighbor as myself. So I can't say that I love God and mistreat people and be telling the truth about my relationship with God. That's what Micah's making clear here. You are idolaters and you are literally horrible, in that some of you totally abuse your fellow man. Now, did you notice what he did? It was interesting. He specifically singled out people who would lie in their beds at night and come up with plots to take from other people so that they could feather their own nest. And so he basically makes it totally clear. You lay awake at night plotting evil, and then you get up the next day and you execute those evil plans just because you have the power and the means to do that. So these people, these sinners, these people in positions of authority, these people with wealth and the ability to do it, were literally practicing might makes right instead of practicing showing love to their fellow man. Basically, and verse 2 says, you covet, you want it, and then you just take it because you wanted it and you had the power to do that. Whether it was someone's property, someone's house. Did you even notice the reference to someone walking by and you literally take the clothes off that person's back? In other words, in your greed, he says, you absolutely take no thought whatsoever to the plight of other people, to the fact that you're making some people homeless. Some people, you're reducing them to the station of a servant or an indentured servant or something less than they were before. You're leaving people broken, helpless, and hopeless. And because of that, God says, I've got a plan for you. You have planned your evil devices. Now I've got a plan for you. Disaster is going to come down on you like a yoke around your neck. In other words, through Micah, God is saying, I'm going to pay you back with the same kind of treatment that you have dished out on other people. God was literally saying, look, I'm going to send Assyria. They'll confiscate some of your land. They'll let you be a servant. They'll make you pay tribute. God is saying, I'm preparing a halter for your neck. Now that is a long ways from going around in arrogance with your nose in the air, taking from people who are victims to your power, position, your authority. Now, okay, we know that it's a done deal for the northern kingdom, but eventually it became a fact for the southern kingdom as well. In verse 4, Micah basically announces that at that point in the future, when all of that stuff happens, that some unnamed person is going to mourn and wail over the ruin that had come that allowed the enemy to seize these fields and these properties that these greedy men have taken such heartless measures to get their hands on. And you know what? At that point, all of the greed, all of the dishonesty, all of the cheating that it took to get those things won't mean a thing, because they will be lost to those persons who took such extreme measures to get their hands on someone else's property. Now, okay, it makes perfect sense that if you're that way, if you're taking advantage of other people, if you're dishonest, if you're vicious and mean-spirited, if you're greedy, that you're going to have those who play up to you and say what you desire to hear in order to feel okay about what you're doing and how you're acting. So there were false prophets, Micah calls them out, who cater to these powerful, wealthy, greedy people. And of course, they want the true prophet to be shut up. They don't want to have to listen to him. They don't want the people to hear him. So, of course, they're very critical of Micah. That makes perfect sense. Excuse me. Because he's bringing a message of judgment. They don't want to hear that. And so, obviously, they want to stop him. They will do just about anything to stop him. Did you notice in verse 6 that the word prophet is not used? Let me reread verse 6. Do not prattle, you say to those who prophesy. Now notice the word prophesy is there, but the word prophet is not. Don't prattle. Don't talk on and on. So they shall not prophesy to you. They shall not return insult for insult. You who are named the house of Jacob, is the spirit of the Lord restricted? Are these things his doings? So Excuse me. So you've got these wealthy people who are talking here, and they're telling Micah to stop speaking words of judgment against them. And that means all of that stuff he said in verses 1 through 4. Now, the same kind of attitude is indicated in Isaiah as well. Isaiah chapter 30, verses 9 and 10. That this is a rebellious people, lying children, children who will not hear the law of the Lord, who say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us right things. Speak to us smooth things. Prophesy deceits. So here in Isaiah, he's the response is, look, don't tell us these things that we don't want to hear. You know that these are rebellious people. These are they're supposed to be children of the Lord, but they're not doing what's right. And these rebellious people say to the real prophets, to the real seers, if you will allow me to use that term, don't tell us that. We don't see that. We don't want to hear about that vision. We don't want to hear about that word from the Lord. In other words, we want to be perfectly content in our sin, doing things the way we want to do them. I have to ask, is that not exactly the way it is today? I mean, people go along their merry way, content, living in their sinful lifestyle. After all, they're having fun, or after all, they're doing it their way, or after all, they've got plenty of time to live like an old man or an old woman before they die. They're young. They just want to have a good time. So the problem is, there was an attitude that was prevalent, a belief that was prevalent, and I have to say it still is, that God's not going to make people suffer. He's a loving God. He's a forgiving God. He's gracious and merciful, and he doesn't want anyone to perish or to suffer. So the people actually had a false sense of security because they believed that God wasn't going to do anything bad to them because he was a loving God. He wouldn't do that. Oh my goodness. I repeat what I alluded to earlier. God does not tolerate willful sin indefinitely. Now notice, I know we all make mistakes. We make mistakes while we're really trying to do our best. But a willful sin that becomes a lifestyle, that becomes a lifestyle of rebellion, is not the same thing. And there is a sundown that eventually comes on that kind of willful sin. I remind you, Hebrews 12:14, pursue peace with all people and holiness, without which no one will see the Lord. 1 Peter 1, verses 15 and 16. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy. So in verse 7, Micah makes it clear, look, what I'm saying is not because of something that God did. It's not because God is suddenly impatient or he's suddenly angry. I remind you that God is not capricious. He does not act on a whim. He does not make hasty decisions that are inconsistent with his nature and his word. He does give warning. He does give a space for repentance. But he's going to do exactly what he says he's going to do. And in sharp contrast with popular opinions and reactions from people who are content in their wickedness, Micah's message and the truth of the gospel today are good for those who want to hear, want to respond, and want to walk in uprightness. And those who reject and don't want to respond in the way that they should, they will always find an out. They will find someone who will scratch ears. They will find someone who will teach a watered down gospel, or they will ignore all of it completely and entirely. Okay, during the rest of chapter 2, Micah very plainly states that the people of God had literally become his enemy. What a sad thing. Listen to verse 8 again. Lately, my people have risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from those who trust you as they pass by, like men returned from war. The women of my people you cast out from their pleasant houses, from their children. You have taken away my glory forever. God says, you are wicked. You are the antithesis of the holiness to which I called you. So instead of serving as a benevolent patron of the downtrodden, instead of helping other people and acting in love, living in obedience to God's laws, they were acting like an enemy, stripping the ones they should have protected, stripping them literally of the essentials of life. I mean, the words of Jesus himself. I mean, if you take someone's cloak, give it back to them at night so they can cover up. Show compassion, show mercy. There's a reference here to widows who lose their homes and their children because of the heartless actions of wealthy and greedy men. Now, these guys were not just stealing clothes off the backs of people or driving people from their homes. They were literally taking citizenship and temple worship rights away from these people. How on earth could they, in good conscience? Well, the truth of the matter is they can't, so they have to ignore, or that conscience has to become seared. So those who have stolen a restful life from others, a life of peace and security from others, will now be treated exactly the same way because they had defiled the land of God with their wickedness, and their prophets, the ones to whom they would listen, only spoke what they wanted to hear. In other words, they were prophets for hire. Now, Micah makes it really clear in an attention-grabbing way. I mean, he says, look, these prophets that speak in a false spirit, not according to God's will, they speak lies. They prophesy of wine and drink and prosperity and everything these rich, greedy people want to hear. And then their message is well received because they say what people want to hear. That kind would be a prattler or a preacher of the people, not a mouthpiece for God at all. So Micah's basically making fun of these people, indicating, well, if you talk about prosperity and plenty to drink for those who want to do that, then of course you're going to have a following and you're going to be very popular. The intention here is that, again, that shock value, that his message would break through the erroneous and foolish thinking of the people and this delusion that God's going to indefinitely ignore willful sin. Clearly, the false prophet's message tickled their ears. They liked it and they accepted it because it was all good and favorable for the people. And it didn't matter that the people were basically wicked at heart. Again, this is totally reminiscent of believers, particularly church leaders today, who blink over evil at best and at worst call evil good. Verses 12 and 13 are different. They are actually the first messianic prophecy, a prophecy that is found in the context of the idea of shepherding. And no doubt it's about our shepherd king, our divine deliverer, the deliverer that was promised to these people as well. that would ultimately one day bring joy to his people, as Micah wants them to understand. Not so much in the lifetime of some of these people, but in terms of God's people in general. And so, as we see these very strong words that Micah has been sharing, I suppose this is the first example of seeing that harsh message modified or toned down a little bit because of what Micah shares about the coming Messiah. Now, we know the northern tribes are going into exile because of Assyria, the southern kingdom eventually at the hands of Babylon. And so this promise that one will break open. Did you notice that? One's going to break open. And that's actually a messianic title here. One's going to break open and deliver. So it is Micah's way of sharing the hope with these people that one day the shepherd king would come and he would aid and lead them out of exile and into a return. Now, the key would be to recognize the authority and the care of this shepherd king. Now, we have to understand that God has always promised that a faithful remnant, albeit small, he would always have a remnant. And so he will always have, Micah is saying here, a remnant of the Jews who would return to the promised land, even though the promised land had been destroyed and defiled, and that time of exile had existed. That time of exile was going to come to an end. And this promised one, this shepherd king, would lead the people out of a gate of freedom, and daily activities would resume in the land. Now, obviously, messianic here. A little bit of difference. Some people think this is a reference strictly to the return from Babylonian captivity and Assyrian captivity. If that's true, there's a glitch because the return of the northern kingdoms as they were before really has not happened per se. We know that there seems to be a suggestion that captives physically and captives spiritually will be set free. So some certainly see an end-time fulfillment here. And no doubt there is a connection to those words from the prophet Isaiah that Jesus got up and read one day. It's recorded in Luke 4, verse 18. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed. Again, whether or not that's exactly a reference to just the end of captivity, I really doubt that. I can't see how it does not have an end-time suggestion. And we know in the last days there will be a move to destroy Israel, but it will not be permitted. The Messiah is going to deliver them, and they will live in peace in the land, and normal activities will be resumed in the land. So, okay. Again, I'm not going to belabor that point, but most definitely it seems to have a long-term fulfillment, or at best, as much of prophecy does, a shorter term and a longer term fulfillment, as even the prophecies of Jesus did, as he was talking about the destruction of the temple. At the same time, he was often talking about end-time events as well. Okay, I have just a little bit of time. Let's see what I could do about at least introducing chapter 3. Let's see how far we can get. Chapter 3, Micah, beginning verse 1. And I said, Hear now, O heads of Jacob, and you rulers of the house of Israel. Is it not for you to know justice, you who hate good and love evil, who strip the skin from my people and the flesh from their bones, who also eat the flesh of my people, flay their skin from them, break their bones and chop them in pieces like meat for the pot, like flesh for the cauldron? Do you notice the analogy with cannibalism here? Then they will cry to the Lord, but he will not hear them. He will even hide his face from them at that time, because they have been evil in their deeds. Thus says the Lord concerning the prophets, who make my people stray, who chant peace while they chew with their teeth, but who prepare war against him who puts nothing into their mouths. Therefore you shall have night without vision, and you shall have darkness without divination. The sun shall go down on the prophets, and the day shall be dark for them. So the seers shall be ashamed, and the diviners abashed. Indeed, they shall all cover their lips, for there is no answer from God. But truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. Now hear this, you heads of the house of Jacob and rulers of the house of Israel, who abhor justice and pervert all equity, who build up Zion with bloodshed and Jerusalem with iniquity. Her heads judge for a bribe, her priests teach for pay, and her prophets divine for money. Yet they lean on the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? No harm can come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion shall be plowed like a field, Jerusalem shall become heaps of ruins, and the mountain of the temple like the bare hills of the forest. In 3 different sections here, Micah is going to call to task these groups that are functioning in such wickedness, and address the leaders both of the northern and the southern kingdom with this call and expectation that they heed and understand. He starts with the political leaders of the ruling class of the people and calls them out for their extreme cruelty. He's like, it ought to be your responsibility to know justice by experience. Of course, that's a reasonable expectation. Instead, they have rejected and abandoned the proven standards of God and substituted their own rules and regulations, which were basically opposite of the standards of God. They ran after evil, they practiced injustice like they were doing right, and did anything and everything, whatever it took, to get what they wanted. Instead of knowing justice, they were haters of good and lovers of evil and mistreaters of people. Now, we know they weren't butchering people and chopping them up, putting them in a pot and eating them. We know that. But they were so immoral, they were literally consuming people by taking away their means of making a living. So the reference to cannibalism is intended to drive home the extreme nature and depth of the wickedness, abuse, and oppression that they were modeling and inflicting on the common people. Micah says they'll cry out to the Lord. He's not talking about a weeping prayer of sincere repentance. That kind of thing moves the heart of God. But here he's suggesting that judgment is going to come because the choice to do evil was premeditated and prolonged. God cannot help but turn his face away from evil and allow justice to take its course. I remind you that God turned his face away from his Son when Jesus Christ took my sin on him. A holy God had to look away. Remember what God expects. Romans 12:9. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil and cling to what is good. Next time, we'll come back and see specifically what he says about the prophets. He's railing on the leaders in the section I just discussed. But Romans 12:9 is good advice for us this week. Let love be without hypocrisy. Abhor what is evil. cling to what is good. In so doing, honor God. Until I see you next time, God bless.